They say a man's secrets are buried with him, but the dead don't stay quiet in the grand, echoing halls of Blackwood. They whisper from the floorboards, they hide in the corners, and sometimes they leave behind a single piece of paper capable of burning an entire kingdom to the ground. 1 month ago, I believed my war was completely over. I had survived the year of isolation, unlocked the permanent royal trust, and saved the 47 outcasts who had become my real family. I had cast my parasitic birth family out into the cold, leaving them to face the financial ruin they had tried to sentence me to. The world looked at me and saw the wealthiest, most powerful widow in the realm. But peace is a fragile thing, and absolute wealth brings absolute enemies. The late Duke's private study was a quiet, octagonal room, tucked away behind the master suite, smelling of old cedar, ancient ink, and dried lavender. Bright sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating the fine wood panels we had spent the last few weeks repairing. On the desk sat the new estate ledgers. For the past 4 weeks, my life hadn't been filled with high society celebrations, but with hard numbers. Rebuilding this place meant tracking every single bag of grain, every bundle of timber, and every winter coat needed for the children currently playing in the courtyard below. Margaret set down a steaming tray of tea, her voice warm but tired as she looked at the tall stacks of paperwork. She told me I had been at the desk since dawn and urged me to drink some chamomile before it turned as cold as the cellar. I smiled faintly, rubbing my temples, and told her that if I didn't balance these accounts by noon, the timber merchants in the village would think their new duchess couldn't count. We had roofs to repair before the autumn rains hit us. Margaret laughed softly, patting my shoulder, reminding me that we had survived the winter on mended bread and prayers. Now that the royal trust was paying out, she insisted a few leaky shingles wouldn't break us, telling me I had given them a future and shouldn't forget to live in it. She picked up the empty tray and walked out, leaving me alone with the steady ticking of the grandfather clock. As I leaned back in the leather chair, my foot brushed against the iron-bound mahogany chest beneath the desk, the exact trunk that had once hidden the record of the Duke's secret charities. Something about the movement felt wrong. When I had moved the chest earlier that morning, it had made a dull, solid thud. But when my boot tapped the base just now, the sound was different. It was hollow and sharp. I knelt on the floorboards, my fingers tracing the dark, dust-coated grain inside the bottom of the trunk. I pressed firmly against the left corner, searching for any inconsistency in the woodwork. With a loud click, a solid panel at the bottom of the chest popped upward, revealing a shallow, velvet-lined cavity hidden underneath. It wasn't filled with gold bars or unmounted diamonds. Resting in the dark space was a small, tarnished silver locket and a single, thick parchment document sealed with a dollop of dark blue wax. My breath caught in my throat as I lifted the paper. The wax bore the late Duke's personal signet, but it was the handwriting on the outside that made my blood run cold. It read, "To be opened only if the Duchess chooses the people over the gold." With trembling fingers, I broke the blue seal and unfolded the page. It wasn't an estate deed or a financial record. It was an official church baptismal certificate from a distant northern parish, dated 25 years ago. My eyes raced across the ink, stopping on the names written at the bottom. Name of child, Thomas. Mother, Elena Vance, schoolmistress. Father, Sebastian Ashcroft, Duke of Blackwood. I whispered his name into the empty room, the parchment shaking in my hand. The world seemed to tilt around me as the truth settled into my mind. The blind musician who sat in my library, the quiet soul who played the violin to soothe the dark hours, the man whose hand I had held as we faced down Lord Vane's thugs, was not a charity case. He was the true, biological bloodline of Blackwood Hall. And as I stared at that official document, realizing the dangerous secrets wrapped around his life, a terrifying question began to form. Did Thomas know his own father had hidden him from the world, or was he a pawn in a game he couldn't even see? Welcome back to Grand Duke Stories. If these tales capture your heart, please like, comment, and subscribe to join our growing kingdom of listeners. Click the notification bell so you never miss a chapter of our journeys. We are heading straight to the library for our next scene, but first, I want to know your theories. Do you think Thomas already knows the truth about his bloodline? Let me know in the comments below, and let's begin. With the baptismal certificate gripped tightly in my hand, I hurried down the long stone corridors toward the east wing. The air grew cooler the closer I got to the library, and soon, the quiet, mournful notes of a violin drifted through the heavy oak doors. Thomas was there, sitting on a velvet bench by the tall arched window where the afternoon sun barely touched the floor. His eyes were milky and unmoving, fixed on the far wall as his fingers moved across the strings, pulling a melody so filled with grief it made my chest tighten. He always seemed to know the exact moment I entered a room, his bow slowing to a gentle stop as he tilted his head toward the sound of my footsteps, listening intently to the frantic pace of my breathing. I walked over and sat down on the leather bench across from him, my heart hammering against my ribs. I told him that I had found something hidden in his father's private desk, something buried beneath a false floor in the old mahogany chest that changed absolutely everything we knew about Blackwood Hall. I reached out, my hand trembling as I gently pressed the old, heavy parchment into his open palms. His slender fingers slowly traced the rough edges of the paper, moving over the broken blue wax of the seal, his brow furrowing in deep confusion as he asked me what it was. I read the words aloud to him, my voice cracking under the weight of the ink as I pronounced his mother's name, Elena Vance, and the late Duke's bold signature, officially recognizing him as a son born 25 years ago. Thomas pulled the paper closer to his chest, his face instantly dropping into an expression of profound shock and sudden heavy sadness. He lowered his head, his shoulders tensing as he asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, why his father would keep such a truth buried in the dark. He wondered aloud how a parent could look him in the eyes every day and leave him to live as nothing more than a blind, wandering musician, dependent on the estate's charity. Seeing the raw, unprotected pain on his face, I felt a deep ache in my chest, completely unaware of the sharp, calculating focus hidden beneath his carefully practiced mask of grief. I reached out and covered his hand with mine, promising him that we would figure this out together. Instead of letting us drown in sorrow, Thomas slowly straightened his posture, using his hands to carefully fold the document back along its original creases with practiced ease. He shifted the conversation with absolute precision, pointing out that an illegitimate birth certificate in a house like this was not a gift. It was a declaration of war. He explained that under the strict high society laws of the realm, a child born out of wedlock was legally considered a non-person to the crown, meaning the late Duke had zero right to name him as an heir or leave him a single acre of land in a standard will. His blind eyes remained blank, staring right through me, but his voice grew steady and commanding as he urged me to understand the true scope of the danger we were in. He warned me that if this document ever fell into the hands of distant relatives, they wouldn't see a tragic family secret. They would see a weapon to destroy us. They would use the fact that the Duke had a secret, illegitimate child to argue that my 24-hour midnight marriage was a fraudulent sham designed to keep the estate away from the rightful bloodline. Without realizing it, I found myself nodding along to his every word, entirely guided by his insights, as he subtly shifted my focus away from his own past and directly toward the massive legal storm gathering just beyond our gates. But that storm arrived much faster than either of us could have anticipated. The oak doors of the library suddenly burst open, the loud bang echoing off the high stone walls and cutting through the quiet room like a gunshot. Thomas flinched, his hand instinctively gripping his violin bow tighter, his head snapping toward the entrance. I stood up quickly, turning around to find Mr. Penrose, our family solicitor, standing in the doorway. His breathing was ragged, his usually immaculate top hat crooked, and his face so pale it looked as though he had just looked into an open grave. In his trembling hand, he held a thick envelope tied with a harsh crimson ribbon. I stepped forward, asking him what was wrong, but he didn't speak right away. He walked toward the desk with heavy, frantic strides, placing the document directly before me. He looked at me with eyes full of dread and told me that the fragile peace we had fought so hard to build was gone. Lord Vane had struck back, and this time he wasn't using hired thugs or back-alley threats. He had gone straight to the highest power in the realm. My hands shook as I untied the crimson ribbon and pulled out the thick parchment inside. It was a formal legal summons from the High Court of Parliament, bearing the dark, heavy seal of the Crown. As my eyes raced down the aggressive, sweeping lines of text, the blood froze in my veins. Lord Vane hadn't acted alone. He had tracked down the late Duke's greedy, distant aristocratic relatives, the branch of the family that had been waiting for decades to sink their claws into the Blackwood fortune. Together, they had formed a vicious alliance and filed a massive, coordinated lawsuit to completely revoke the permanent royal trust. The ground seemed to give way beneath my feet as I read their exact legal argument. They were exploiting a brutal, real-world loophole in high society law. They argued that because my midnight marriage to the late Duke had lasted only 24 hours before his passing, and because the union had produced no children, I was nothing more than a fraudulent widow. They claimed I had no right to hold a historic crown estate without a legitimate wedded heir, and they were demanding that the courts immediately seize Blackwood Hall, dissolve the trust, and evict every single soul living within these walls. Mr. Penrose sank into a nearby chair, rubbing his face in utter exhaustion, explaining that if they won this suit, the sanctuary would be entirely demolished by the Crown, and the 47 outcasts we protected would be thrown into the streets before the winter arrived. I collapsed back onto the bench beside Thomas, the weight of the document crushing the breath from my lungs. Every sacrifice I had made over the last year, every long night of isolation, and every boundary I had set against my own greedy family was about to be undone by a single, heartless legal maneuver. From the shadows of the window, Thomas sat perfectly still, his blind eyes fixed on the empty space in front of him. But beneath the desk, out of my line of sight, his hands clenched into tight, rigid fists, his jaw tightening with a cold, terrifying anger. The trap had been sprung. Our enemies were closing in, and to save our home, I was going to have to play a high-stakes chess match against the most corrupt minds in the kingdom. To fight the vultures of high society, I could no longer look like the girl they thought they could easily crush. I had to become the Duchess they feared. The next morning, the Grand Master bedchamber felt heavy, with a solemn, battlefield energy. The dawn light was grey and cold, casting long shadows across the high stone walls. I stood before the full-length gilded mirror, my breath shallow as I slowly stepped out of my familiar, rough wool apron and the simple, stained dresses I wore while working alongside the outcasts in the gardens and kitchens. Those clothes were my badge of honor, the garments of a woman who worked with her hands, who lived among the people she protected. but they offered absolutely no armor in the vicious, glinting ballrooms of the city. Margaret stood behind me, her chest heaving with nervous breaths as she lifted the heavy, majestic velvet and silk of my formal duchess gowns from the dark depths of the cedar wardrobe. She didn't speak, but her hands trembled slightly as she shook out the fabric. Layer by layer, the agonizing transformation began. The stiff, bone-lined corsets were pulled tight around my ribs, constricting my lungs and forcing my spine into an unyielding, dangerously regal posture. Next came the heavy layers of petticoats, followed by the deep emerald velvet gown itself. The fabric was dense and unforgiving, weighed down with thousands of tiny, intricate silver threads embroidered into patterns of wild vines that trailed across the bodice and cascaded around my feet in massive, sweeping folds. As Margaret fastened the heavy family jewels around my neck, cold, glittering diamonds that felt more like a metal collar than a decoration, I looked at my reflection and felt a chill. The servant girl from a broken home, the defensive daughter, was completely gone. In her place stood a formidable ruler, draped in the ancient, intimidating wealth of Blackwood Hall. Just as the distant sound of carriage wheels crunching against the gravel driveway signaled it was time to depart for the city, a soft, deliberate knock sounded at the door. It was Thomas. He didn't cross the threshold into the room, standing perfectly still right at the doorway with his head tilted to the side, listening intently to the unfamiliar, heavy rustle of my thick silk skirts. He wore his usual simple dark coat, but he held a small, beautifully carved wooden box in his hands, his long, slender fingers tracing the intricate geometric patterns on the lid with a gentle, reassuring rhythm. I walked over to him, the heavy weight of the emerald velvet gown trailing like a shadow behind me on the stone floor. As I drew near, the mask of the fearless Duchess slipped for just a moment. I told him, in a voice that betrayed my youth, that I was terrified. I confessed that while I knew how to manage estate accounts, bargain with local grain merchants, and care for the outcasts, I had absolutely no idea how to survive the psychological warfare of the aristocracy. I was entering a world where a single misplaced smile could ruin an entire lineage. Thomas stepped closer, bridging the distance between us. His blind, milky eyes remained fixed on the space ahead, but his voice dropped into a lower, warmer, and more intimate register than I had ever heard from him before. He reached out into the empty space between us, his hand unerringly finding mine with surprising accuracy, his warm palm covering my cold, trembling fingers. He told me that high society was nothing more than a poorly constructed theater of whispers, and because he had spent his entire life in the dark, he had learned to hear exactly what people truly meant beneath their polite, venomous words. He advised me that when Lord Vane and the greedy distant relatives tried to bait me with public insults about my low-born past or my childless marriage, I must not offer a defense. He said that to the aristocracy, defending oneself looks like a confession of weakness, an invitation for a predator to strike harder. Instead, he urged me to stay silent and simply watch the way they held their breath. He told me to listen for the sharp, nervous catches in their voices when I casually brought up the late Duke's hidden financial records. He whispered that the entire nobility was built on a fragile foundation of hidden debts and desperate pride, and if I remained perfectly calm, their own arrogance would eventually force them to expose their vulnerabilities out of sheer panic. As his low voice washed over me, his thumb gently brushed against the back of my knuckles, a gesture so deeply protective, tender and grounding that a profound wave of warmth rushed through my veins, completely shattering the cold fear that had paralyzed my chest. He placed the small wooden box into my hands, explaining that it contained a set of his father's old ivory writing tablets for me to take notes during the court proceedings. But the emotional weight behind his voice went far beyond a simple parting gift. In that quiet, shadow-drenched doorway, stripped of all the noise of the incoming legal war, a powerful, unbreakable bond locked between us. I wasn't just fighting to keep a roof over the 47 outcasts anymore. I was fighting to protect the legacy of the gentle, blind musician who stood before me, completely unaware that he was the master strategist who had already mapped out every single square on the board. But the warmth of his hand was quickly replaced by the icy glare of the city. The carriage ride into the capital felt like a descent into a gilded cage. By the time the horses pulled up to the grand town estate where the pre-trial gala was being held, the night sky was filled with the heavy scent of rain and expensive carriage oil. The mansion was ablaze with light, thousands of candles illuminating the massive glass windows. As the footman opened my door, the overwhelming sound of high society chatter and classical string music poured out onto the cobblestones. I gripped Thomas's ivory writing tablets tightly inside my velvet cloak, took a deep, steadying breath that strained against the tight laces of my corset, and stepped down into the fray. The grand ballroom was a dizzying display of wealth, a sea of silk, diamonds, and sneering faces. The moment the crier announced my title, April Ashcroft, Duchess of Blackwood, the music seemed to falter. A suffocating silence rippled through the front of the room as hundreds of aristocratic eyes locked onto me. They weren't looking at a peer, they were looking at an intruder. I walked down the marble steps, my heavy emerald velvet gown trailing majestically behind me, my posture unyielding just as Thomas had instructed. But before I could even reach the edge of the floor, a sharp, mocking laugh cut through the music. It was my father. Standing beside him were my sisters, Beatrice and Clara. I froze, my stomach turning at the sight of them. But as I looked closer, Thomas's advice echoed in my mind, and I forced myself to truly see them. They were draped in silk, yes, but the edges of my father's cuffs were slightly frayed, and the jewelry Beatrice wore was outdated and tarnished. They were drowning in debt, living on borrowed time and desperate pride. Next to them stood Lord Vane, swirling a glass of dark wine, a malicious, triumphant smirk plastered across his face. My father stepped into my path, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of hatred and desperate greed. He bowed mockingly, calling me the Grand Duchess of an empty nest. Beatrice stepped forward next, her voice dripping with venom as she looked at my emerald gown, loudly wondering how a mere scullery maid had learned to dress like royalty. Clara giggled behind her fan, whispering that it was a pity the gown wouldn't fit her when the court seized it by the weekend. Lord Vane took a slow sip of his wine, stepping into the center of the circle, ensuring his loud voice carried to the nearby lords and ladies. He told me that I looked exceptionally beautiful for a woman who was about to lose absolutely everything. He sneered, stating that a 24-hour marriage to a dying man was nothing more than a pathetic, desperate fraud. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper as he told me that the law required a legitimate bloodline heir to hold an estate as massive as Blackwood, and since my womb was as empty as my claim to the title, the High Court would strip me of the crown, the lands, and the wealth by Friday afternoon. My father nodded eagerly behind him, declaring that when the outcasts were thrown into the mud where they belonged, he would ensure the courts returned me to his house as a penniless servant to learn my proper place. The entire circle of aristocrats watched me, waiting for me to cry, to scream, or to beg for mercy. My heart was pounding, the insults stinging like whips against my skin. But instead of defending myself, instead of letting the anger show on my face, I stood perfectly still. I remembered Thomas's words. Defense looks like a confession of weakness. I looked directly into Lord Vane's eyes, completely ignoring my family. I let a slow, entirely calm smile spread across my lips. I adjusted the heavy diamonds at my neck, took a slow breath, and observed the way Lord Vane's hand tightened around the stem of his wineglass, the slight tremor in his fingers. I noticed the way my father nervously shifted his weight from foot to foot. They weren't confident. They were terrified that this lawsuit was their last remaining gamble to avoid absolute ruin. I looked at them all, my voice calm, clear, and perfectly steady as it carried across the ballroom floor. I told them that Friday was still several days away, and in my short time as Duchess, I had learned that those who count their winnings before the game is finished usually end up sleeping in the streets. I turned on my heel, the emerald velvet sweeping away from them in a defiant arc, leaving the vultures standing in a stunned, suffocating silence of their own making. But the moment I escaped the suffocating heat of the ballroom and entered my temporary city quarters, the mask of the fearless Duchess completely shattered. The townhouse was dark and quiet, a stark contrast to the glittering nest of vipers I had just left behind. I collapsed onto the chaise lounge, my hands trembling as I tore at the suffocating laces of the corset, gasping for the cold city air filtering through the window. My father's cruel laughter and Lord Vane's smug declaration that I would be stripped of everything by Friday echoed relentlessly in my mind. The sheer weight of high society's hatred felt like a physical anchor dragging me down into the mud. I wrapped my arms around myself, staring into the cold fireplace, wondering if I really was just a fool playing a game meant for monsters. A soft, frantic tapping on the window pane suddenly broke the silence. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. I hurried to the glass and pushed it open, looking down into the dim alleyway. Standing below, drenched in the heavy city mist, was Barnaby, a young, trusted carter from the Blackwood estate. He was shivering, his cap pulled low, but when he saw my face, he gave a quick nod and reached into his woolen vest. He pulled out a small, tightly rolled cylinder of parchment wrapped in a scrap of oilskin to protect it from the damp air. He threw it upward, and I caught it against my chest. Barnaby gave a short salute and vanished back into the shadows of the city before anyone could see him. My fingers flew over the twine, pulling away the oilskin. Inside was a single page covered in tight, elegant handwriting. It was from Thomas. I held the paper close to the single candle on the desk, my eyes racing across the ink. Thomas wrote that he knew the city would feel like a battlefield, and he knew exactly how the vultures would try to tear at my confidence. But then, the tone of his letter shifted from comforting to something incredibly sharp and strategic. He wrote that over the past 10 years, while sitting invisibly in the dark corners of the Blackwood Library, the visiting high court lawyers and arrogant distant relatives had always assumed the blind charity musician couldn't hear or wouldn't understand their private whispers. They were entirely wrong. Thomas detailed a massive hidden vulnerability in the enemy's camp. He revealed that the greedy distant relatives spearheading the lawsuit weren't actually financing this multi-thousand-pound legal war themselves. They couldn't afford to. They had secretly signed a predatory, back-alley contract with a corrupt syndicate of city bankers, promising to sell off the ancient timberlands and demolish the outcasts' cottages the moment they won the estate. But Thomas had noticed a fatal flaw in their arrangement. The syndicate's funding depended entirely on a strict moral clause deadline. If the lawsuit was delayed by even 24 hours past Friday, or if a competing, older bloodline claim was introduced to cloud the title, the bankers would legally withdraw their capital to protect their own assets, leaving the relatives completely liable for the devastating court costs. As I read his precise, brutal analysis, the breath caught in my throat. Thomas had given me the exact psychological leverage I needed to break them. He had handed me the keys to their ruin. I stared at the elegant ink, a profound sense of awe and relief washing over me. From his quiet, dark corner miles away at Blackwood Hall, this gentle blind man had seen through the armor of the wealthiest men in the kingdom. I clutched the letter to my heart, the fear completely evaporating from my veins, replaced by a fierce, burning determination. The vultures thought they were marching toward an execution on Friday, but tomorrow morning, when the High Court convened, I was going to turn their legal trap into their own graveyard. The morning arrived with a suffocating, heavy grey fog that rolled off the river and wrapped itself around the towering stone spires of the parliamentary courthouse. By the time my carriage came to a halt outside the massive wrought-iron gates, the streets were already choked with onlookers, street vendors, and eager journalists clutching ink-stained notebooks. The scandal of Blackwood Hall had become the singular obsession of the kingdom. Stepping out into the cold air, I held my head high, the heavy emerald velvet of my gown sweeping across the damp stone steps as I marched inside. The grand parliamentary courtroom was a terrifying, cathedral-like chamber. High, vaulted ceilings stretched upward into the shadows, and tiered wooden galleries rose on either side, packed to absolute capacity with aristocratic spectators dressed in their finest silks and furs. They had all come to watch the spectacular fall of the scullery-maid Duchess. As I took my seat at the defense table, alongside a visibly sweating Mr. Penrose, a collective, venomous whisper rippled through the gallery above. I forced my eyes upward, scanning the sea of faces, and immediately locked onto my birth family. My father was leaning over the polished wooden railing, a gleeful, mocking grin plastered across his face, while Beatrice and Clara giggled beside him, already celebrating the inheritance they believed would soon be theirs. Directly across the aisle sat Lord Vane, flanked by a small army of the most expensive, ruthless lawyers the capital's banks could buy. He caught my gaze and raised his glass of water in a silent, triumphant toast. The thud of the magistrate's wooden gavel echoed through the chamber, silencing the crowd and signaling the start of the execution. Lord Vane's lead prosecutor, a sharp, predatory man with silver hair and a voice like grinding stones, stepped into the center of the courtroom. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He began weaving a devastating, meticulous narrative that targeted my very existence at Blackwood Hall. With dramatic gestures toward the gallery, he presented their core argument, exploiting the brutal, archaic loophole Thomas had warned me about. He shouted to the judges that the ancient crown lands of Blackwood were never intended to be a playground for charity or a haven for the destitute. He argued that under the sacred laws of the realm, an ancestral crown estate of such immense historical value could not legally be held by a short-term, childless widow when direct, living blood relatives existed. He paced back and forth in front of the magistrate's bench, his voice booming off the stone walls as he laid out the timeline. He reminded the court that my midnight marriage to the late Duke had lasted less than 24 hours, a mere blink of an eye. It was a union that produced absolutely no children, no direct lineage, and no future for the house. He claimed that my possession of the estate was a grotesque distortion of the law, a fraudulent manipulation designed to lock away a massive fortune from the Duke's true, aristocratic bloodline. With a final, theatrical flourish, he pointed a shaking finger directly at me, demanding that the High Court immediately revoke the permanent royal trust, strip me of the title, and return Blackwood Hall to the rightful relatives who stood ready to restore its aristocratic honor. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic roar of agreement from the spectators. My father stood up in the gallery, openly cheering, while Mr. Penrose buried his face in his hands, whispering that we were completely ruined. The legal trap had been sprung perfectly, and the judges were already nodding in agreement, prepared to sign the eviction orders. They believed I was cornered, entirely defenseless and drowning in panic. They had absolutely no idea that I was simply waiting for the clock to strike, holding the exact piece of paper that would rip their entire world apart. When the magistrate finally demanded to know if the defense had anything to offer before the final ruling was handed down, a heavy, expectant silence fell over the massive room. I stood up slowly, smoothing the heavy emerald velvet of my gown, and walked with deliberate, unhurried steps toward the center of the courtroom. The journalists leaned over their desks, quills poised, expecting me to beg for a monthly allowance or weep for mercy. Instead, I looked directly up at the judges and told them that the prosecution's entire case was built on a deliberate, desperate lie. I stated clearly that Blackwood Hall was not without a direct bloodline heir, nor was I a childless widow holding an empty house. A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the gallery, and my father's gleeful smile faltered slightly as he leaned further over the wooden railing. Lord Vane scoffed openly, crossing his arms as if watching a child play a foolish game. I reached into the hidden velvet pocket of my skirt and pulled out the old parchment document, unfolding it with a crisp, echoing snap that commanded the attention of the entire room. I announced to the High Court that hidden within the late Duke's private study, beneath a secret panel in his mahogany chest, lay the absolute proof of the Blackwood lineage. I read the words aloud, my voice ringing out like a bell through the vaulted ceiling, presenting the official, sealed baptismal certificate from 25 years ago. I named the mother, Elena Vance, and I named the father, Sebastian Ashcroft, the late Duke of Blackwood. Before the prosecution could even object, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Every head in the room snapped around as two of our trusted residents guided a tall, composed figure down the center aisle. It was Thomas. He moved with a quiet, breathtaking dignity, his simple dark coat contrasting sharply with the flamboyant silks of the aristocrats around him. He held his violin case tightly in one hand, his head slightly tilted as he listened to the sudden, chaotic gasps of the crowd. His milky, unmoving eyes were fixed straight ahead as he was guided to the front of the stand, standing beside me like an unyielding stone wall. I turned back to the judges and officially introduced Thomas to the court as the true, biological son of the late Duke, the living bloodline of Blackwood Hall. The courtroom erupted into absolute pandemonium. Journalists began frantically scribbling in their books. Spectators stood on their seats to get a better look at the secret son, and my father's face turned an ash-gray color as he clutched the gallery railing in sudden terror. Lord Vane slammed his fist onto the prosecution table, his chair screeching violently against the floorboards as he surged to his feet. He laughed loudly, a cruel, mocking sound that desperately tried to regain control of the room. He turned to the judges, pointing a trembling, dismissive finger at Thomas, and scoffed that this was nothing more than a pathetic, theatrical circus. He shouted that even if this piece of paper was authentic, it changed absolutely nothing under the sacred laws of the realm. He argued venomously that an illegitimate child born out of wedlock was a legal non-entity to the crown, possessing no rights, no status, and no lineage. He stepped closer to Thomas, his voice dripping with pure malice, as he proclaimed to the gallery that a blind, common musician, a man who spent his life begging for charity in the dark, had zero legal standing to inherit a noble title or touch a single coin of the Blackwood fortune. Lord Vane sneered, confident that his legal loophole was still ironclad, entirely unaware that by forcing Thomas's illegitimacy into the open, he had walked directly into the deepest, most lethal trap we had set for him. Lord Vane sneered, confident that his legal loophole was still ironclad, entirely unaware that by forcing Thomas's illegitimacy into the open, he had walked directly into the deepest, most lethal trap we had set for him. He stood there gloating, a triumphant grin spreading across his face, as the prosecution lawyers nodded in smug agreement. The lead judge raised his wooden gavel, his eyes cold and unsympathetic as he prepared to deliver the final, crushing blow that would strip me of everything and throw 47 innocent souls into the streets. But before that gavel could hit the wooden block, I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the heavy tension of the room like a razor blade. I told the High Court that Lord Vane was absolutely correct about the standard laws of the realm regarding illegitimate children. I conceded that Thomas could not inherit the title of Duke on his own. Lord Vane laughed out loud, turning to the gallery to soak in his victory. But my voice grew louder, calmer, and infinitely more dangerous as I directed the judge's attention to the velvet-bound ledger sitting on the defense table. The ancient, foundational Blackwood Charter, signed by the first king of the realm centuries ago. I demanded that the court clerk turn to the foundational bylaws of the estate, specifically the clause regarding the preservation of the royal line during times of contested succession. A suffocating silence fell over the chamber as the old clerk's fingers scrambled through the yellowed pages. I recited the archaic law from memory, my eyes locked directly onto my father's pale, sweat-slicked face in the gallery. I revealed the ultimate counter-move hidden within the ancient text. If a reigning, crown-appointed duchess chooses to unite the estate by marrying a direct, biological bloodline descendant of the house, regardless of the circumstances of his birth, the lineage is legally unified, the title is secured, and the royal trust becomes permanently and absolutely unbreakable by any court in the kingdom. The lead judge froze, his gavel hovering inches from the desk, his eyes widening in pure shock as he looked down at the clerk, who nodded with a trembling jaw, confirming the validity of the ancient law. Lord Vane's smile instantly vanished, his face draining of all color, as he stammered that the clause was irrelevant because I was a widow. I turned slowly to face him, a cold, victorious smile spreading across my lips. I reached out and took Thomas's hand, locking my fingers firmly with his. I looked up at the high galleries, addressing the journalists, the whispering aristocrats, and my ruined birth family, and delivered the shockwave that would paralyze the entire kingdom. I announced that as the reigning Duchess of Blackwood, I was exercising my sovereign right under the Royal Charter. I officially announced my immediate, legal marriage to Thomas Ashcroft. The courtroom erupted into absolute, deafening chaos. Spectators leaped to their feet, shouting over one another, while journalists frantically scrambled out the back doors to sprint toward the printing presses. My father collapsed backward into his seat, clutching his chest in total disbelief, while Beatrice and Clara buried their faces in their hands, realizing their final gamble at wealth had just evaporated into thin air. Across the aisle, Lord Vane staggered backward against his table, knocking over his glass of water as it shattered against the floorboards. He stared at us, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, completely paralyzed by the realization that his multi-thousand-pound lawsuit was dead. By forcing the issue of a legitimate heir, he had driven me straight into a union that legally locked the Blackwood estate forever. Beside me, Thomas stood perfectly still amidst the roaring madness of the court. His hand was warm, his grip tightening around mine with a fierce, quiet intensity. He kept his blind, milky eyes trained forward, maintaining his perfect mask of a humble, overwhelmed musician for the crowd. But as the judges reluctantly began slamming their gavels to concede our total legal victory, I felt the unmistakable, subtle shift in his posture. The trap had closed perfectly. The 47 outcasts were safe, our enemies were ruined, and the blind strategist standing at my side had just become the most powerful man in the realm. The heavy thud of the head magistrate's final gavel echoed through the chamber like a clap of thunder, officially bringing an end to the spectacular trial. When the magistrate spoke, his voice was no longer cold and dismissive. It carried the absolute, unyielding authority of the crown. He looked down at the documents before him and announced that under the strict historic terms of the ancient Blackwood Charter, the union between the reigning Duchess and the biological bloodline of the house was completely valid, binding, and beyond the jurisdiction of any standard parliamentary suit. With a sharp flick of his wrist, he officially dismissed the relatives' claims in their entirety, declaring the permanent royal trust fully protected and legally untouchable for generations to come. But the magistrate was not finished. He turned his piercing glare toward the prosecution table, where Lord Vane stood frozen, his face the color of sour milk. The judge stated that because this massive lawsuit had been brought forward under false pretenses of estate preservation, and because it had disrupted the Crown's peace with predatory intent, the court was invoking the full penalty of the law. He ruled that the distant relatives and their primary architect, Lord Vane, were entirely responsible for every single pound of the legal fees incurred during the trial. A collective gasp rippled through the high galleries, followed by a wave of frantic whispering. Lord Vane staggered backward, his knees buckling slightly, as the full weight of the verdict hit him. Thomas's coded letter had been a flawless prophecy. By forcing the trial to a definitive ruling on Friday, the predatory contract with the city banking syndicate was instantly triggered. Looking across the aisle, I watched the exact moment absolute ruin settled into Lord Vane's eyes. Two High Court clerks marched toward his table, carrying formal asset seizure writs bearing the crimson seal of the Treasury. Because he had leveraged his own ancestral lands, his townhouse, and his shipping vessels to finance this multi-thousand-pound legal war, the immediate withdrawal of the banker's capital left him completely exposed. The clerks informed him, in loud, clinical voices that carried across the entire room, that his accounts were being frozen, his properties were to be liquidated by the weekend, and his noble name would be entered into the Crown's registry of bankrupt debtors. His high-priced lawyers didn't even look at him. They immediately began packing their leather cases, eager to distance themselves from a man who was now a financial pariah. Lord Vane turned his head slowly, looking up at the gallery for support, but the very aristocrats who had cheered for him the day before now looked away, whispering behind their gloved hands, utterly destroying whatever shred of reputation he had left in the kingdom. He was no longer a powerful lord or a dangerous threat. He was a broken, bankrupt outcast, ruined by the very legal trap he had meticulously designed to crush me. His high-priced lawyers didn't even look at him. They immediately began packing their leather cases, eager to distance themselves from a man who was now a financial pariah. Lord Vane turned his head slowly, looking up at the gallery for support, but the very aristocrats who had cheered for him the day before now looked away, whispering behind their gloved hands, utterly destroying whatever shred of reputation he had left in the kingdom. He was no longer a powerful lord or a dangerous threat. He was a broken, bankrupt outcast, ruined by the very legal trap he had meticulously designed to crush me. With the courtroom clearing out in a flurry of whispers and rushing reporters, Thomas and I walked out of the heavy wooden doors together, his arm resting securely in mine. The cold, crisp air of the capital hit my face as we stepped onto the grand marble portico overlooking the city square. Below us, a crowd of onlookers and journalists waited, their faces turned upward. But before we could even descend the first flight of stairs, a frantic, disheveled figure rushed out from behind one of the massive stone pillars, intercepting our path. It was my father. The arrogant, mocking grin he had worn in the gallery just an hour ago was completely gone. His cravat was crooked, his hair was wild from the wind, and his eyes were wide with a desperate, terrifying panic. Beatrice and Clara stood a few paces behind him, weeping silently into their lace handkerchiefs, suddenly realizing that the luxurious life they had stolen from my labor was officially over. My father threw himself toward me, his hands reaching out to grab the heavy emerald velvet of my sleeves, but I stepped back, letting the fabric sweep out of his reach. He fell to his knees right there on the cold stone steps, his voice cracking and trembling as he looked up at me. He didn't call me a scullery maid or an embarrassment anymore. He called me his beautiful, brilliant daughter. He begged me to have mercy, crying out that the timber merchants and the city banks had already arrived at his estate to seal the doors and seize his remaining furniture. They were completely penniless, with nowhere to sleep and nothing to eat by nightfall. He pleaded with me to let them come back to Blackwood Hall, promising that he would be a dutiful father, that my sisters would behave, and that we could be a real family again in that grand, warm house. Standing there, watching the man who had sentenced me to a life of labor and isolation beg for his survival, I felt a strange emptiness in my chest. There was no anger, no urge to scream, and no satisfaction in his tears. There was only the solid, unyielding truth of who he was. Beside me, Thomas stood perfectly still, his chin tilted slightly upward as he listened to the frantic, shallow gasps of my father's breathing and the distant sobbing of my sisters. His hand on my arm tightened just a fraction, a silent, grounding reminder of the strength we had built together. I looked down at my father, my posture completely rigid, my voice dropping into a calm, ice-cold tone that brooked absolutely no argument. I told him that I would not leave him to starve in the streets, not out of affection, but because the Duchess of Blackwood does not allow anyone on her lands to perish from neglect. I informed him that I would grant him the small, abandoned stone cottage located at the absolute furthest edge of the village boundary, near the northern woods. I would ensure the village carter delivered basic provisions, grain, timber, and simple wool blankets, so they would survive the coming winter. My father's eyes lit up with a sudden, desperate hope, and he began to thank me, reaching out again. But I cut him off with a single, sharp raise of my hand, the silver embroidery on my cuff catching the gray light. I looked him dead in the eyes and enforced my final, permanent boundary. I told him clearly that while they could sleep under a roof provided by my charity, he and my sisters were permanently banned from ever setting foot on the grounds of Blackwood Hall again. I warned him that if he, Beatrice, or Clara ever crossed the outer iron gates, or if they were ever seen whispering to my staff, or the 47 outcasts we protected, the provisions would stop instantly, and my guards would escort them directly to the county line. My father froze, his mouth falling open, as the absolute finality of my words settled into his chest. He realized that the grand halls, the warmth of the fires, and the wealth he had tried so hard to steal were forever locked behind a wall he could never breach. I turned away from his stunned, silent figure, the heavy velvet of my gown trailing across the stone, as Thomas and I walked down the steps toward our waiting carriage, leaving the ghosts of my past entirely behind us in the mud. The journey back to the countryside felt like a slow awakening from a long, suffocating nightmare. As the iron wheels of the carriage rolled away from the gray smoke of the capital and broke through into the open, sun-drenched hills of the estate, The heavy silence between Thomas and me softened into something deeply peaceful. The afternoon sun broke through the remaining clouds, casting a golden light across the velvet seats. When the carriage finally turned down the long, winding driveway of Blackwood Hall, a sound drifted through the open windows that made my chest tighten, not with fear, but with a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion. It was the sound of cheering. I leaned forward, looking through the glass, and tears instantly blurred my vision. Lining both sides of the gravel road, stretching all the way from the outer iron gates to the grand stone steps of the manor, were the 47 outcasts. They were all there. The elderly laborers who had been threatened with eviction, the young mothers holding their infants, the scarred and the forgotten souls we had promised to protect. They were weeping openly, waving handkerchiefs, and throwing wild meadow flowers onto the path of the carriage. The air was thick with a triumphant, deafening joy. They knew. Word from the printing presses had traveled fast, and they realized their sanctuary was no longer a fragile dream. It was an unbreakable fortress, secured forever. The carriage came to a halt, and the footman threw open the door. As I stepped down into the crisp, clean country air, a roaring shout of gratitude went up from the crowd. "Long live the Duchess," they cried. "Long live the Duke." I turned back to help Thomas down, but as his boots hit the gravel, he didn't adjust his mask or retreat into his usual quiet posture. He stood tall, his head raised toward the sound of the cheering crowd, a soft, incredibly genuine smile gracing his lips. He let the warmth of their voices wash over him, stepping fully into the sunlight as the true co-ruler of Blackwood Hall. We walked up the grand stone steps together, stopping at the top of the portico to turn and face the people. The atmosphere was electric, filled with a profound sense of shared victory. I looked out over the sea of smiling faces, my heart swelling with a fierce pride. We had done it. We had beaten the vipers at their own game. As the crowd began to slowly disperse into the gardens to celebrate, Thomas turned toward me on the stone terrace. The grand oak doors of our home stood open behind us, but neither of us moved to go inside. The afternoon breeze caught the edges of my emerald velvet gown, rustling the fabric against his dark coat. He reached out, his long fingers moving through the air until they found my cheek. His touch was incredibly gentle, his thumb lightly tracing the line of my jaw as he tilted my face up toward his. His milky, unmoving eyes were fixed straight ahead, but the sheer intensity of his focus made me feel as though he could see right into the deepest corners of my soul. He whispered my name, his voice thick with an emotion he had kept locked away through all the long months of secrecy. He told me that when he sat in the dark courtroom, listening to the aristocracy try to tear my dignity away, he had realized that the ancient charter didn't save Blackwood Hall. I had. He said that I had stepped into a den of wolves to protect his father's memory, the outcasts, and a blind musician who had no right to expect such fierce devotion. As he spoke, he stepped closer, closing the distance between us, until I could feel the steady warmth of his breath. He shifted his hand, his fingers tangling into the thick curls of my hair, drawing me in with a quiet, undeniable strength. When his lips finally met mine, the entire world, the courtrooms, the legal traps, the cruel whispers of high society, completely vanished. The kiss was slow, deep, and filled with a fierce, possessive tenderness that left me breathless. It was a silent vow, a recognition that our marriage was no longer just a brilliant strategic maneuver to defeat our enemies. It was the beginning of a profound, unbreakable romance between two equals who had rewritten the laws of the realm just to belong to one another. Standing on the threshold of our secure home, wrapped in the arms of the master strategist who had helped me save it, I knew that the true story of Blackwood Hall was only just beginning. The celebration that followed inside the grand hall was unlike anything the ancient stone walls of Blackwood had ever witnessed. Gone was the cold, suffocating formality of the city galas. In its place was a glorious, raucous feast, filled with genuine laughter, clinking glasses, and the heavy, rich aroma of roasted meats and sweet autumn pies. The long oak tables, which had once hosted snobbish lords and ladies, were now packed with the 47 residents we fought so hard to protect. Children chased each other through the shadows of the vaulted arches, their joyful shouts echoing up to the rafter beams, while the older laborers raised their tankards in endless toasts to our victory. But the true magic of the evening began when the chatter faded and Thomas stepped up to the small dais at the front of the room. He unclasped his violin case, his slender fingers moving with a familiar, reverent grace as he lifted the instrument to his shoulder. For months, I had only ever heard him play melancholic morning tunes, melodies born from a lifetime of living in the shadows as a secret, unacknowledged son. But tonight, as his bow touched the strings, the sound that soared through the grand hall was completely transformed. It was a melody of pure triumph. The notes rose like wildfire, bright, fast, and fiercely beautiful, filling every corner of the massive room with a soaring energy that made my heart race. It was a song of new beginnings, a declaration of freedom for every single soul under this roof. The residents clapped their hands to the rhythm, some weeping tears of pure relief, as Thomas played with a passionate, free strength had never been allowed to show the world until now. He looked magnificent in the golden glow of the hearth fire, his head tilted, guiding his people into a future where they would never have to live in fear again. As the music reached its spectacular crescendo and the hall erupted into a deafening cheer, I caught Thomas's subtle nod toward me, a silent, intimate acknowledgement between co-rulers. Knowing the celebration would carry on long into the night, I quietly slipped away from the warmth of the crowd, the heavy emerald velvet of my gown rustling softly against the flagstones as I walked down the dim corridors toward the east wing. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the library, stepping into the deep, welcoming silence of my favorite sanctuary. The room was bathed in a soft, flickering glow from a dozen freshly lit candles. On the massive mahogany desk sat the heavy iron lockbox containing the final, official deeds of Blackwood Hall, freshly stamped with the permanent, unassailable seal of the High Court. I walked over and took my seat, letting out a long, slow breath that completely deflated the remaining tension in my shoulders. One by one, I carefully filed the legal documents away into the deep drawers, smoothing the crisp parchment with my fingertips. For the first time since the late Duke had passed, the heavy, crushing weight on my chest was entirely gone. Looking out the tall, arched window at the quiet, moonlit gardens below, a profound, absolute peace settled into my soul. The legal wars were won, my greedy birth family was banished to the boundaries, and the shadows that had threatened to swallow this house had been permanently driven away. We had not just survived, we had conquered. And as I locked the final drawer, hearing the distant, faint notes of Thomas's violin still echoing through the distant halls, I knew our home was finally safe. But that peace lasted only a single, heartbeat-long second. A soft rustle of paper drew my eyes away from the window. I turned toward the deeply recessed reading alcove at the far end of the library, assuming Thomas had quietly followed me in to escape the noise of the feast. He was indeed sitting there, bathed in the amber glow of a 3-wick candelabra. His violin case lay closed and latched on the floor beside his chair. But as I took a step forward, the breath completely vanished from my lungs, and my entire body went entirely rigid. Thomas was holding the Ledger of Mercy, the massive, leather-bound record where I kept the private names, histories, and financial debts of all 47 outcasts. The book was laid wide open across his lap. His long, slender fingers weren't tracing the edges of the parchment or feeling for the texture of the wax seals as they always had. He was reading it. His head was tilted down, his face completely relaxed, his eyes scanning the closely written lines of dark ink from left to right with absolute, fluid ease. There was no hesitation, no straining, and no blind searching. He flipped the heavy page over, his gaze instantly locking onto the top of the next column, tracking the numbers with the sharp, practiced precision of a scholar. The silence in the library became heavy and suffocating, thick with a sudden, paralyzing terror. The distant, joyful thumping of the celebration in the grand hall felt a million miles away. My heart hammered against my ribs, a cold sweat breaking out across the back of my neck as 1,000 different memories rushed through my mind in a chaotic blur. The way he always knew the exact second I entered a room, the terrifyingly accurate legal advice he had given me, the flawless manner in which he had handed me the writing tablets. My shoe clicked softly against the stone floor as I staggered back half a step. At the sound, Thomas didn't tilt his head to the side to listen with his ears. Instead, he raised his face in one smooth, deliberate motion. He didn't look past me, and he didn't stare blankly into the empty space of the room. He locked his eyes directly onto mine. The milky, clouded film that had supposedly veiled his sight for 25 years was completely gone. In the warm candlelight, his eyes were a piercing, extraordinarily sharp, and perfect gray. They were bright, clear, and intensely focused, holding my gaze with an unyielding, magnetic strength that made it impossible for me to look away. There was no blindness in them. There was only a profound, calculating intelligence. Keeping his sharp gray eyes fixed entirely on mine, he calmly, slowly extended his hand and brought the heavy leather cover of the Ledger of Mercy down, closing the book with a quiet, definitive thud that echoed like a death knell through the silent library. He was never blind. The helpless, wandering charity musician who had begged for my protection, the man I had married to save the estate, the co-ruler who had just gained total legal dominion over the wealthiest trust in the kingdom, had been watching every single move I made from the very beginning. My voice was nothing more than a ragged whisper, trembling under the sheer weight of the betrayal. I asked him how he could do this, how he could look me in the eyes and lie to me, to the outcasts, to the entire realm. Thomas didn't flinch. He stood up slowly from the chair, his tall frame casting a long, commanding shadow across the mahogany desk. He stepped out of the alcove, moving with a fluid, lethal grace that was a far cry from the hesitant steps of the man I thought I knew. He told me that his blindness was never a weapon meant to deceive me. It was the only shield that kept him alive. He walked over to the tall, arched window, staring out at the moonlit grounds as he revealed the terrifying truth of his past. 20 years ago, when he was just a child, the Duke's greedy, distant relatives discovered his existence. In a desperate bid to eliminate the true bloodline, they set fire to his childhood cottage in the dead of night. His mother barely smuggled him out through the smoke before the roof collapsed, but the assassins were relentless. To save his life, his father, the old Duke, brought him to Blackwood Hall under the guise of an orphaned, blind charity musician. The aristocracy stopped looking for a dangerous heir when they believed the boy was a helpless, sightless commoner. For 2 decades, he wore the mask, living in the literal and figurative dark, waiting for the day he could strike back. But as I processed the horror of his childhood, Thomas turned back to me, the candlelight catching the sharp, cold angles of his face. He told me that surviving was only the first phase of the plan. The ultimate shock came when he stepped closer, his piercing grey eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my heart stop. He whispered that the late Duke didn't plan our midnight wedding. He did. I staggered back, my hand hitting the edge of the desk for support. The room seemed to spin as Thomas laid out the terrifying scope of his genius. From his quiet corner in the library, he had spent a year tracking my movements. He watched my resilience, my fierce protection of the outcasts, and he knew I was the only woman with the iron will necessary to rule Blackwood Hall. To force the pieces into motion, Thomas was the one who covertly leaked the financial debt data to my greedy father, knowing it would drive him to bargain me away to the late Duke. He had meticulously orchestrated the timeline, ensuring the marriage happened exactly 24 hours before his father's passing, perfectly setting the legal trap that would draw Lord Vane and the relatives into a reckless, expensive lawsuit they were guaranteed to lose. Every single event, the summons, the gala, the presentation of the certificate, was a line of code he had written. I stepped back again, my mind reeling, utterly stunned and terrified by the sheer, calculated brilliance of the man standing before me. He was a master chess player, and I had been his most valuable pawn. Seeing the raw panic in my eyes, the cold, strategic mask on Thomas's face suddenly fractured. He crossed the distance between us in a single stride, bridging the gap before I could retreat any further. He reached out and caught my hands, his grip firm, warm, and remarkably desperate. He pulled me close, his breath brushing against my cheek as his voice dropped into a raw, vulnerable whisper. He confessed that while choosing me to be his duchess was a cold, calculated strategy to save the sanctuary, falling completely in love with me was the only variable he never saw coming. He told me that he had prepared for every legal loophole, every aristocratic insult, and every financial move, but he was entirely defenseless against my warmth, my courage, and the genuine heart that had shattered his armor. He looked down at our joined hands, his perfect grey eyes shining with a fierce, terrifying devotion, as he whispered that the throne was ours, the outcasts were safe, and though the game was won, his heart belonged entirely to me.